All right, welcome back to the Ottawa studios of Inside My Canoe Head. I'm your host, Dr. D. Today, we are going to talk about the coming fiscal cliff and the reality that the government will not be able to cover your losses in a disaster and what that means. So sit back, grab yourself your favorite beverage. Let's get at her. All right, welcome back and welcome to August. For those of you that missed the last episode, fantastic to have you here in our listening audience, whether you're watching this on YouTube, whether you're listening to it across all available platforms. We appreciate you. Keep your comments coming. Drop over to insidemycanoehead.ca, a website dedicated just to this podcast. Everything is there. We'd love to have you. Drop over, say hi. Reality of the world is right now that we are living in a set of conditions where governments are spending more than they earn. It's called deficit financing. Today, what we want to talk about is what are the impacts of this continual process on the ability of the government to cover its expenses, right? There's something called a fiscal cliff that, depending on who you speak to, is either close within years or maybe a decade out, but it is an inevitable mathematical certainty that if we continue down this current path of government spending and taxation levels, that there will be a point where the government simply won't have money for extra things or unplanned events. What that means is, imagine you have a loss. Imagine you have a significant disaster in a Canadian city or in an American city. People didn't have insurance, or what they couldn't buy insurance for something. The event occurs, massive losses happen, and everybody simply has to declare bankruptcy because the government can't hand out any money to anybody because it doesn't have any money to hand out to anybody. That's where the fiscal cliff starts. That's the point that we're headed towards. And again, depending on who you talk to, it could be a couple of years out or it could be a decade out. And so for preparedness, what the grounding foundation of this podcast is, knowing that your government is choosing to do this and the options it has, and it's driving blissfully unaware or totally aware, depending on your political lens, towards this fiscal cliff. What does it mean for you? So that's what we're going to talk about today. Let's get after it. So when we talk about how the economic systems run, we're not going to sit here today and give a long, drawn-out discussion on it, but save those people who support modern money theory. MMT, if you Google MMT, it talks about how there's a group of economists, a small but vocal group of economists, that believe there's a methodology where governments simply can have unlimited amounts of money and hand out unlimited programming to people. The rest of us live in reality. We understand that perpetual deficit financing does have a life cycle. Now, basic deficit financing is when a government raises $1 million in taxation, but it spends $1.5 million in program expenses every year, right? So it runs a deficit in the year of $500,000, right? It has to go raise that money from somewhere. And what it does is its central bank issues a bond on the market at so much of an interest rate and says, come give us the money by buying the bond, and we'll pay you interest when the bond matures in their short, medium, and long-term bonds. So basically, a government has the ability to go out, pay people interest to raise that additional money so it can spend 1.5 times revenue, right? Happens in governments around the world. We're approaching that in many OECD nations, which is the Office of Economic Coordination and Development, where debt to revenue models provide an uncomfortable picture. Now, we've heard about debt to GDP ratio, measures the output of a nation in total, but that steady is an average of 121%. So that means that the debt sits at 121% on average in the OECD of GDP. What is more concerning, and what I base the argument on today, is the ratio of debt expenses to revenue. So according to 2022 World Bank figures, Canada expends 6%, the United States expends 11.5%, and the United Kingdom expends 11% of their government revenues on interest payments alone. So this is interest on deficits in the past. So after the fiscal year is over, the deficit gets added to the national debt. So every year the national debt grows incredibly large, and the U.S. have debt clocks and other countries do as well. And you can go Google what your national debt is. Here in Canada, I think it's close to $2 trillion. So when you look at Canada owes $2 trillion to somebody, right? And those $2 trillions over the 100 years of Canada's existence or more since we started going into debt have been raised by issuing government bonds. So people hold those bonds. We owe them interest. We're not paying back the $2 trillion Canada borrowed. We're simply paying somebody interest. That interest is that percentage. So in the United States of America, 11.5 cents of every dollar the government raises from all the sources goes to just pay interest on the debt. It's not paying any of the previous deficits off. It's not paying any principal, right? And with interest rates expected to stabilize at a 3-to-1 ratio from the lows of post-2008 years where we had that gluttony of money that was available, this is only going to increase and continue to spend as governments continue to spend in excess of revenue. And governments do that across the world, right? Very few governments have balanced budgets, right? So governments will go out and promise the world to get elected. This is what politicians do, right? They promise to pay for everything for you, great program, great expenses, great offerings for you. You elect them. And because they realize if they just tax the living snot out of you to cover the costs of government, you wouldn't elect them. Because as soon as they come along and say, you know, the rational argument is, I'm going to give you these wonderful programs, right? We're going to expand Medicare in the U.S. We're going to expand defense spending. In Canada, we're going to grow some pretty significant social programs. But to do that, I need to raise your income tax rates by 20%, right? What's the answer they're going to get? They're not going to be elected. They're telling you the truth. The governments at current rate do need to increase income taxes by at least 20, if not 30% on everybody from the single mother with 3 kids to the billionaire. Everybody needs to be paying significantly more tax if we want to afford the government programs we currently have, let alone the ones we would like the government to add. But as soon as a politician comes to the table and offers that, they don't get reelected. So what they do is they offer the benefit without the cost, and the cost goes on to the debt. Now, that's fine because really you're just giving it to the grandchildren and we're screwing the next generations, but whatever. That doesn't matter right now because you get the cool money and the government gets to get reelected and everybody's happy. But this comes at a cost, right? Now, there's a taxation ceiling for governments, and I spoke about that, a point at which they're no longer to be elected or that significant reduction in economic activity occurs. As you draw more and more taxation from the population, you crowd out economic development. There's a whole just Google crowding out economics, and you'll get a great little lesson on what happens when there's a lot of government expenditures. It crowds out corporate and the private sector expansion, right? Now, there's great ideas, innovative taxation ideas out there. Wealth taxes, social media linked taxes, which we've tried here in Canada, hasn't worked out very well, or corporate excessive profits. I mean, the end result of all of these measures is upward pressure on the price level, which is inflation. This means that every tax we impose on a corporation, they pass through to consumers, which leads to higher prices for consumers, higher inflation, and it leads to governments not being reelected, right? Because you can call for government taxation. Say you want to double taxation on governments, right? On corporations, sorry. Every time you increase a tax on a corporation, they pass it on to their consumers, right? There's no way to get around that. Corporations don't eat taxes, right? You can't make them eat taxes. So the government doesn't have the ability to say to a corporation, I'm doubling your tax, but I'm preventing you from raising your prices, right? They can't do that. The system totally collapses when you think. So you don't have that control. So your governments have the right to increase taxation levels to whatever they want, but they also then own the impact of their decision. So as the price level goes up, everything gets more expensive. And what happens? We rise up as a population and we toss out the government for somebody who promises to reduce price levels and reduce inflation. Now, the only way to reduce inflation is to reduce spending. It's a really difficult argument to say that the very checks that people depend upon from the government are a good reason why the prices and inflation is so high. We have to stop handing out money to everybody to bring down the price level. But then people say, well, if you don't hand out the money to people, they won't be able to afford things. It's a circular argument that eats itself up. So when we translate this to a timeline, there's really heterogeneity out there. And that simply means that nobody is in agreement whether the fiscal cliff is going to be reached in a couple of years or a decade, but really nobody talks about the fiscal cliff being beyond a decade. So we're really within a decade of us as a society having to come to terms, right? To having our come to you-know-who moment and to sit back and decide what we intend to do, right? If we reach that fiscal cliff, the government will no longer be able to burden additional spending, right? These generally cause a run on currency, insolvency in the banks, or a run on banks, and restrict the ability to raise additional revenue, right? They get to a point that they can't raise additional money because they can't sell any bonds anymore because they can't afford to pay the interest on additional debt, right? Quantitative easing you've heard about, it's been used in the past. It was used in 2008. It was used at sometimes during the pandemic. It's temporary because all that quantitative easing is that the central bank runs in there and buys a whole ton of treasuries available at really dirt low interest rates, but they hold them on their ledger, and that comes home to roost, presenting an additional risk. Google quantitative easing. I don't want to go down that road all day today. Spending sprees are coming to a close. The summation of this argument is it's true across all government departments, including emergency management. The end result is we're coming to a point where we're going to have that discussion. While we know that the frequency of disasters across the world is constant, the number of fatalities to disaster continues to fall significantly. The cost of disasters, however, is increasing exponentially. This is due to the increased replacement cost of our complex systems in society, which places additional pressure on our most important risk transfer insurance. We've seen increases in policy costs and the uninsurability of entire regions, some like Florida, California for fire risk, Florida for flooding and hurricane risk, due to the risk profile for loss. As greater and greater losses are incurred by insurance companies, they have to continue to raise policy rates to cover the cost of insurance. They have to build up a pool of money to be able to pay out to the insured. As those policy rates have a ceiling, right? There's a point at which policy rates become unaffordable. They have to go that high for the insurance company to be able to mitigate their own risk and losses because they can't go insolvent. But it gets to a certain level where it's just uninsurable, right? For example, it could get to some flooding regions in the United States of America or Canada where it's $20,000 a year to cover your home for flood insurance. Think about that. How many people have 20 G's squared away in their bank account that could cover flood insurance? It gets to a point where to have the policy in place by a private insurance company becomes so cost ineffective and cost prohibitive that they simply walk away, right? Some relief is offered by governments to cover a portion of those losses. They're called uninsured losses. So when a disaster strikes, whatever it may be, there's insured losses. So people have insurance. You buy insurance. People know very little about their insurance. And this is something that I've talked about at length on this podcast and many of my writings online and in both of my books, is talking extent about insurance is our greatest single risk transfer, right? It is the one thing that we should know intimately, be totally aware of, and know all of our inclusions or exclusions. Unfortunately, the reality is what happens to most people is they don't understand the true limitations of their insurance policy until they've had a loss and they're talking to an insurance adjuster, right? Oh, I didn't know that. I didn't know this type of flooding. Overland flooding's not covered. If your pipe bursts in your house, it's covered. But if the flood comes overland and into your house, there's no coverage. Well, how do I pay for it? Well, you don't. That's the point. You now have an uninsured loss. You had insurance, but it didn't cover the calamity that happened. You weren't aware of that, so you made no precautions, because most people are totally unaware. When they buy home insurance as required by their mortgage company, they seek the lowest cost compliant bidder, pay for it, and walk away and don't even read the bloody policy. And then when they have a loss, they're shocked to learn that that low policy premium was a result of a whole slew of exclusions and deductibles that have now put them in a disastrous, pun intended, position, right? And then you have the uninsured losses. So people who have had a loss, but their insurance doesn't cover it, or insurance was not available, or insurance was prohibitively expensive for them. So for whatever reason, individuals have no insurance, but they've suffered a major financial loss. Those insurable uninsured losses are normally to date covered by some form of government programming. Now, depending on what jurisdiction you're in, the United States of America through FEMA distributes this. Through Canada, it's through the disaster funding assistance arrangement that goes down through from the federal government to the provincials, to the municipalities, to individuals to cover losses. Generally, in the idea, it's 80% of the uninsured loss, right? So you're still going to suffer a loss personally, but somebody magically comes flying in from left field with a check for you for an uninsured loss, right? Those uninsured losses are growing exponentially at government levels. The government expenditures on uninsured losses are going through the roof, and they're adding to the unsustainability of excess government spending, which is totally contributing to the fiscal cliff that we're driving our nations towards. So, governments have done this historically, and there is legislation in place saying the government has a responsibility to do this, and we have a moral code in our society that we believe so. But the point is, within a decade, if governments continue the deficit financing at current rate, there'll be a situation where this fiscal calamity is a certainty. The exponential growth in disaster losses will not slow, and as available funds for governments are to leverage are reduced, there is a point where support checks to disaster victims become impossible. Imagine a disaster where no insurance was available, and irrespective of the legislative framework or the wishes of the constituents, the government simply will not cover any losses. Families and corporations will declare bankruptcy, walk away from everything, and begin again. In the United States of America, this happens far too often for people with uninsured medical losses, right? You get a medical bill, you can't pay it, you go bankrupt. Well, that's going to be the status quo for disaster losses, right? So you have a fire that runs through Paradise, like with 88 people lost their lives in Paradise, California. You have a fire like that, uninsured losses from wildfire, every one of those families that were in the town go bankrupt. They've lost everything, right? They have to go bankrupt. That's going to be the standard in the future. So for preparedness, we look at the idea of how do we mitigate against that? How do we take steps knowing full well that the government may not be doing this? What can you do knowing this train is driving off a cliff, and soon your ability to count on the government to give you money in times of disaster losses, whether it be a monthly check to support your income during a pandemic, or whether it be to cover flooding costs when you couldn't buy or didn't buy flood insurance, right? When those days come to an end, and they will, what are you intending to do to cover your losses? How do you intend to recover from a major loss without any insurance coverage? There are strategies, there are ideas. In the second half of this podcast today, we're going to talk about a couple of ideas that you can consider. One is location. Remember how the old state with real estate is location, 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 right? You live in a democratic country, right? For the most part, 90+% of the listeners of this podcast, which is heard in 50+ countries around the world, is democratically leaning. Let's just call it that. There is some countries with more government influence than we would like, but it's a democratic country, which means you have freedom to choose where you live, right? There is no risk-free location anywhere on the face of this globe. It doesn't exist. You can't choose a place that is not exposed to a natural hazard. It's just not possible. You also have hazards from economic, political, cultural, ideological frames, familial, depending on the state of your local or immediate family. The point being is you have to assess the level of risk of where you've chosen to live now. And if that's unsustainable or looking like it's going to be unsustainable, then you need to move to a location that has less risk. Now, you can't eliminate risk, but your choice where you live is up to you. And by choosing to live there, you assume the risk associated with it, right? People don't like to hear that. I don't care. Everywhere you live has a risk. You assume the risk. Now, ignorance is not an excuse. You can say, I didn't know. I don't have time to look at it. That's fine. That's perfectly good for you to say. You still assume the risk for where you choose to live. So your first mitigation strategy is to determine whether you have appropriate insurance of where you live now, and can you sustain that? Are those price increases that are likely in your policy costs intelligent and maintainable, or do you need to either cut your losses and change your type of housing of where you live, or to leave the location altogether? That's your first mitigating strategy that you have as an individual. And because you have time, depending on who you believe, years to a decade before we get to this fiscal cliff, you have the opportunity to sit back and think, okay, I'm a Class A mechanic, I'm an electrician, I'm a lawyer, I'm a doctor, I'm a member of the military, I am an entrepreneur, I work in the banking industry, whatever your industry may be. Where can I transfer my skills to put myself and my family in a lower risk geographical location that still allows me to chase my dreams, rock an incredible life, do the things that I want to, great opportunities for my family to grow up, to raise the children, but I'm doing so in a less risky environment. So number one opportunity you have is to look, reflect, and plan if necessary to change your physical location. You live in a democratic country, feel free to go where you want to. The second one is to take the necessary steps to mitigate potential loss. And this is where you've decided, hey, I'm going to live in a certain place or I'm going to stay where I am. My risk profile is flooding. How can I reduce flooding? For example, we have one area outside of Ottawa here where I live that floods periodically. And so what a number of families have done is they had an insurance claim for flooding. And so they've gone back to the insurance company and said, okay, I'm going to raise my house 8 feet. I'm literally going to build a concrete pillar foundation on my house 8 feet. You see concrete pillars around Florida. You see concrete pillars around the coast of most countries where homes that are on beachfront, etc., are actually raised a good 10, 12 feet off the ground on pillars because you have tidal surges. You have storm surges. These things happen. So what do? I'm not going to leave because I love the area. I don't want to go, or I can't go for any number of circumstances. So I'm going to raise my house by 8 feet. Now, this costs money. Yes. It takes maybe a couple of years to save for. Yes. But it is a strategy where that's just one example. Another one is if you live in a wildfire zone. We've seen lots of losses in 2023 and 2024 due to wildfires, right? There's a great program called firesmart.ca. And it talks about all different things that you can do as a homeowner to mitigate the effects of a wildfire against your home. And there are several cost-inducing things. So, for example, you can remove all flammable material from within 10 meters of your home or 30 feet, right? Just make sure nothing combustible, including sheds, including anything, is within 30 feet of your home. That's one thing. And as you get more and more up in the cost factor, you start talking about my home's exterior has to be fireproof, like fireproof. That means well over 80% of fires ignited on homes and structures are done so by embers, right? Because forest fires create their own ecosystems, have strong winds. So these burning embers go flying through the air. They land on things and they light things on fire. So if you have what FireSmart defines as a defensible area around your home. So imagine your home and you have this 30-foot gasp around your home where there's nothing flammable. The exterior of your home is 100% fireproof. So all the embers till time immemorial can land on your home and nothing's going to catch fire, right? There's also gel coating that's available that you can have on hand and put on your home in times of emergency that can mitigate if you can't afford to change the exterior of your home. So there's a whole bunch of strategies on FireSmart. So this is you understanding that for whatever reason, I've got my dream home, I've got my location, my family's in this area. Dude, I'm not going anywhere. Fantastic. Second question, if you're not going to change your location, change your circumstances. Take the mitigated measures that reduce the probability that the hazard you face in your area is mitigated. So if you're in a wildfire zone, right, you work hard to clear literally 100 feet around your house. All of the trees are gone. None of this tree overhang in the backyard crap that causes things to burn. You get rid of all of that. You make it a clearing. You make your home fireproof. And now you're pretty much good to go when it comes to wildfire, right? You dramatically, to the greatest extent possible, reduced your exposure. And I'm going to argue from my limited conversation with insurance folks, and I cannot guarantee this, that you're likely going to get a reduction or an increased offer of insurance coverage when you take these steps to go for. So you've got risk avoidance, which means go to a different risk profile, but a lower one. You've got risk mitigation in the middle. And the last one is the free. I don't recommend this to any, but it is an option. So we're going to present it anyhow. It is the risk free for all, right? And what I mean by that is you are going to understand, I live in a flood zone. I'm not going to mitigate my house against a flood. I'm just going to understand that if I have to walk away, I'll walk away. And so it's a strategy designed to say, when I lose this house to flooding and I go bankrupt, what am I going to do, right? Because remember, if your house gets flooded or if your house is lost to a wildfire, you still own the mortgage, right? There's no house there, but you still have a mortgage on the house and you still owe your monthly mortgage costs. And you still own your property tax, right? That doesn't go away simply because your house was burned down. You still owe that, right? And you just can't stop paying your mortgage because your house burned down, because the mortgage company you've signed on that debt, they're going to come looking for their $500,000 or their $250,000 of mortgage that you have outstanding, and you have to pay that. That goes to collections. You don't get away from that. That's called bankruptcy, right? That is an option. And listen, there are some people who have high ratio mortgages. So for example, you have a $500,000 house and a $450,000 mortgage. You've got $50,000 equity in there. If you lose that house, you go bankrupt and you've lost $50,000, right? Of course, bankruptcy sucks for a whole bunch of other reasons, but listen, it's a reality. It happens to people in the United States of America fairly regularly because of medical bills, right? They just accept the fact that they don't have medical insurance, and they accept the fact that when a significant calamity happens to me, I will get the life-saving care, and then I will go bankrupt because of it. People just accept that that's the reality that they live in, and they go for it. So for insurance losses, it's not one option I recommend, but we give you all the options here at Inside My Canoe Head and all the ideas that you can do. So really, there are strains. First, we didn't talk about political advocacy here because I try to stay 100% out of political. I'm not 100% good at it. And feel free to call me out when I do err a little bit on that. But you can advocate for what you think and what you believe is correct. Remember, but in a democracy, I get a vote. I get a say. I don't get the final say. So I get to vote for whomever I want and the policies and processes that I think are appropriate for the nation at this time in history. And so does everybody else. And if everybody else largely disagrees with me, then that's the country I live in, right? Nothing's wrong. That's exactly how it's supposed to work. So keeping politics out of it, I'd always say advocate. Absolutely. Advocate for what you believe in. Advocate for what you believe is right. Do the things that you should. I've said it right when if you look back at some of the things that I've talked about 3 rules of life, right? Number one of them is to follow the rules. To be a good citizen, it's your responsibility to follow the rules. It's also your responsibility, and I would argue your obligation, to lobby and advocate for positive changes to increase the human condition, to protect the human condition. Now, that doesn't mean you get to break the rules. And if you don't like the rules and they're against what you think, well, you always have the opportunity to up your roots and go to a different country. You know, there are some 180 plus democratically elected countries around the world, and every one of them have immigration rules and opportunities. So if you don't like the rules in the country where you live, you are free to advocate for change. And if it's really that tough on you, you're free to sell your property and move along. But the point is here that you do have an ability to do something about this. It is coming. The fiscal cliff is a reality. The spending spree of governments have to stop, or they have to raise the taxation to meet their spending levels, which they perfectly can, but everybody who advocates for higher taxation does not get reelected. So the odds of us successfully electing a government who advocates for higher taxes, and I don't care who they put taxes on. You tax the billionaires, you tax the millionaires, you tax the corporations. It is all going to end up in all of our pockets in price transfer. So we are headed towards this fiscal cliff. It's a reality. It's avoidable, yes, absolutely. But there doesn't seem to be any strong ethos towards that. So as such, understanding that this will affect your coming ability to look to the government for uninsured disaster losses, I would offer that now, potentially up to a decade out, and most economists actually lean farther than closer. So if you're looking at 8 to 10 years before we really hit that fiscal cliff, you've got time now to consider what your uninsured losses looks like. And that starts with recipe number 1. And I say this continuously, intimately know your insurance policy. Every clause, every exclusion, the detailed process that you're to follow in times of a loss, and the detailed coverage and what the expectations of your insurance company are. You need to know that. And then you can reflect on the hazard profile, where you live. Does your insurance cover the needs? And I've used this example before. I live in Ottawa, Ontario. We have an earthquake risk here. I almost got knocked out of my desk at work in 2009, hanging on for dear life as the whole building shook. Earthquake insurance is not part of your standard insurance here. You have to buy a rider. You have to buy an additional policy. If you don't, and my house gets damaged by an earthquake, I'm on my own and the government has to come bail me out. Well, that may occur in the future and there may be no money. So I have a damaged home. One, I'll have to repair on my own with my own money, or I have to walk away from and knock it to the ground and go bankrupt, right? There you go. Those are my options. So I have strategies. I've laid out a couple here for you today. And just to start thinking, and the whole idea of some of these topics that we bring up here at Inside My Canoe Head are to just get you thinking, to understand the environment in which you live, and the impact of decisions that are beyond your control. You and I don't control government spending. You and I don't control government taxation. You and I don't control hazard risks from natural events or political or economic or cultural or ideological or familial. All the other things that can influence and cause risks in our lives, we don't control those. What we do control is the strategy we choose to employ to navigate those potential situations. That's what risk acknowledgement and risk intelligence is all about. Understanding your risk profile, checking your insurance, making sure that number one, risk transfer is well covered, understanding any gaps that exist, and then sitting down with your favorite beverage, cup of coffee, cup of tea, whatever it is, over by a warm fire on your wood fireplace. Love that. And then figure out as a family, what are you going to do about that? If that was to occur, what are you going to do? Great conversation to have. So thank you very much for joining us again on this episode at Inside My Canoe Head. Please keep your commentary coming. At the bottom of Inside My Canoe Head, there's an email there to jeff@preparednesslabs.ca. There's also a link over to preparednesslabs.ca, our main corporate page. Keep your commentary coming in. And if you do nothing else, I ask you to do one thing for us here, and that is to share with a friend or a colleague that Inside My Canoe Head, Canada's #2 podcast on preparedness, is a great place for you to park 2 episodes a week. So thank you very much. Take care and stay safe.